Welcome to the Compact Podcast. This week we're discussing Vladimir Putin's visit to North Korea. He's not quite there yet as we record this show, but Pyongyang is apparently all decked out to welcome him. Russia needs ammunition and North Korea needs money and perhaps international recognition. In the wake of a recent article published in Compact about AI, in particular the article by Zephyr Teachout, a former special advisor and senior counsel for economic justice at the New York Attorney General's office and professor of law at Fordham, who argued against social media use in children, saying that the ultimate problem is civic and even spiritual in nature. On Monday, the US Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, said that he wants a warning label placed on social media platforms advising parents that using them might damage adolescents' mental health. This requires Congress approval. And finally, we discuss a recent article in The Atlantic by Xochitl Gonzalez entitled, "Why Do Rich People Love Quiet?", in which the author recounts being told to shush in computer rooms and college accommodation and writes the following: "It took me years to understand that in demanding my friends and I quiet down, these students were implying that their comfort superseded our joy. And in acquiescing, I accepted that." Another line from the article: "But one person's loud is another person's expression of joy." I'm your host, Nina Power, and I'm joined today by Saurabh Amari and Jeff Schellenberger. So, Putin's visit to North Korea, what do we make of this non-US approved forms of multipolarity and pariah states to some people's eyes, talking with each other and perhaps making deals?
So it seems of a piece with the broader phenomenon that really U.S. posture on Ukraine is kind of creating this, axis of sort of revived axis of evil, at least as far as the David Frums of the world are concerned, which I think it's clear that these countries would not be drawing together as closely were it not for the belligerence of the West and NATO. And I guess my overall sense is that's not good. That we shouldn't be causing these countries to find common cause with each other, and I would be in favor of a more accommodating foreign policy that attempted to diffuse tensions. So all of that is relatively obvious. I think it's interesting to recall Trump's strange friendship with Kim Jong-un, where initially there was this kind of ratcheting up of tensions where they were like tweeting furiously at each other and making all sorts of bizarre and absurd threats. But then they sort of managed to find some sort of understanding. And, I think Trump's foreign policy record is pretty mixed. And I'm not necessarily as as convinced as perhaps some people we've published that he was, broadly a figure who embodied a consistently, peace-friendly foreign policy. But nonetheless, I do kind of think back more fondly to the gestures of a more conciliatory posture he was willing to make, and the seeming desire to diffuse rather than escalate tensions with these various these various foreign powers. So, to me, this just seems like the latest development in terms of how this quite aggressive NATO posture is kind of pushing these other countries into alliance with each other to an extent that they likely wouldn't be if there was more of an interest in peace. So that's broadly what I have to say on that.
I would simply add that this is also a reminder of the weakness of Western-led sanctions and blockade regimes in trying to stop a determined adversary of the scale of Russia, or in the future potentially China, from being able to arm up and to in general to maintain their relationships across the world, and to not be isolated. This should alarm people who imagine that, for example, that the US can fight a two-front or even three-front war against the kind of the three great Eurasian landmass powers, namely Russia, Iran, and China, because in a lot of these states are now so interconnected and also so industrially capable themselves that, and of course they have abundant energy resources in the case of Iran and Russia, that the kind of sanctions-led effort to deter them or stop them is bound to fail. And so it's like a reality check about what we're not. In a way, we're not dealing with what used to be called rogue regimes anymore, because a rogue regime, even in terms of linguistically speaking, it implied a world in which, most of the world was under a certain US-led dispensation, US-led kind of form of hegemony. And then there were like the exceptions, Saddam's Iraq, or Iran, the Taliban, and so on. You're not dealing with that anymore. You're dealing with several large land-based powers with serious economies, serious kind of self-sufficient industrial capability that are arming each other in interesting ways. I mean, as an Iranian who has had drilled into him since childhood this sense of inadequacy with respect to imperial Russia, which treated Iran as one of the prize in what was called the 19th century Great Game to divide up Western and Central Asia between Britain and the Russian Empire. The idea that, and of course they did, and Iran had to concede a great deal of territory in the course of the Great Game in the 19th century. The idea that now Iran is arming Russia, like giving Russia drones, is pretty astonishing. It's not, from a U.S. perspective, it's not something I celebrate, but it's just an astonishing fact of the way that things don't remain the same. And it's kind of regretful, just to echo Jeff, that the U.S. at its kind of peak moment of supremacy in the 1990s and then the early 2000s wasted so much of its credibility, energy, resources on these stupid wars, and in some cases convinced other states that the U.S. is out to topple them all the time. And so they went into a kind of autarkic mode and developed industrially and developed their relationships among themselves, such that now they have this kind of network of like mutual support. My second thought on this is just kind of imagining this from a goofier point of view. Like, one can't help but think of the classic film Team America, of like the sort of global baddies, including leaders from North Korea meeting up together and planning nefarious acts, and Matt Damon being out there trying to stop them.
Yes. Indeed. So we saw some interesting footage from North Korea of all of the banners and signs with Putin's face on, and I must say, there is a kind of almost nostalgia for this ceremony of diplomacy. I'm not sure the West really engages us in the same majestic way anymore. But yeah, so in any case, we shall see if North Korea and Russia help each other out. This is also in the wake of the peace summit over Ukraine in Switzerland. Obviously, Russia was not invited. China didn't attend. I think we're trying always to pay attention to these new alignments, new realignments, new power blocks, and so on. We'll undoubtedly come back to these questions.
But just very quickly, I mean, what kind of a peace conference doesn't have one of the major adversaries? What? Who thinks up these things? Like, of course, the Chinese aren't going to show up because it insults your intelligence. Like, it insults the world's intelligence to act like this. Sorry, I'll stop. But it's just like, what? It just doesn't compute for me. But clearly, for very, very powerful people in the West, it does. So I don't know.
Well, I think conceptually it's very difficult for people in the West to give up on a certain political hegemony, right? Like to imagine that they're not the only beings in the world. It's yeah. No. Okay, back to technology. So we recently published this great piece by the wonderfully named Zephyr Teachout, which was looking at the impact of social media on children and young people. And she presents this question not only in a sort of political way in terms of legislation, but also in terms of like what she described as the spiritual impact on children. And it's interesting to link that in with the proposed warning labels that the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has been talking about for quite a long time now, actually. He proposes that social media needs guidance labels like that we have on cigarettes and alcohol, warning labels. Not sure where you would put them, on the phone or maybe on different platforms, different screens. And he also called for technology companies to share internal data on the health impact of their products, to have safety audits, independent safety audits, and I think to restrict features like push notifications, autoplay, and infinite scroll. And I think we're all probably prey to, I certainly am prey to the latter. The infinite scroll of Twitter is indeed deeply compelling. And this is someone who didn't use the internet until I was 18 and didn't have a phone until I was 23. So I think this concern about young minds and the kind of very powerful impact, addictive qualities and potentially destructive qualities is very important. And I think Teachout makes clear that social media also takes children and young people away from real life social interactions, hobbies, church, sports, and all of those things, and this is something I'm sure we're all very familiar with. We see children out using technology a lot, and those of us who have children, I'm sure you have very deeply complicated decisions to make about how much access you permit, if any, when, what kind, and all of those things. I certainly see that with my brother and his children. So reflections then on Vivek Murthy's proposals for the warning labels.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there's a part of me that's wants to be cynical about this and point out that this can sometimes echo like Tipper Gore insisting that rap music carry, the parental advisory like label about dangerous lyrics, and the fact that, I'm a smoker, and daily I look at the Surgeon General's warning on my packs of cigarettes, and it is, just horrific outcomes spelled out about, my reproductive organs not working tomorrow, my cancer, early death, hideous teeth, and like yet I go on, but smoking, at least for now. But that said, like, insofar as this move by the Surgeon General Vivek Murthy indicates the emergence of what seems to me, and to Zephyr, whom I've spoken with about this, is a kind of bipartisan consensus is emerging that, whoa, this stuff is getting really dangerous for democracy. We had also another great piece by a pair of economists, my friend Luigi Zingales of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and his colleague Tom Santos of the Columbia Business School, about how the very model of big tech is designed to undermine the business model. The profit model assumes the destruction of the kind of actual Tocquevillian communities upon which American democracy rests. So you have that issue, and then all the stuff that Zephyr points out in her piece, all the sort of technological trickery and also like neurological trickery that is used by big tech to addict children to social media. I mean, my kids don't have phones; they're blessedly like too young still. But I immediately sent the piece, like while I was still editing it, I sent the raw copy to my wife and was like, "You got to read this. Look at," because I didn't even know about some of the strategies they use to keep you going, especially keep kids scrolling. So as Zephyr points out in her piece for Compact, they only give you what they know you want. They like don't give it to you right away. They give it to you after a certain amount, the algorithm, after a certain amount of surfing. When it determines you're about to leave, then it gives you that video that it knows you want based on your other preferences. That's like unbelievably devious if you think about it. And there are many others of the kind. And one of my favorite reactions to Zephyr's wonderful essay for us, which was published, as like right after New York State enacted its own law attempting to limit some of these very addictive elements of social media. By the way, the headline on that piece is "Ending Big Tech's Child Exploitation" by Zephyr Teachout for CompactMag.com. The fact that this New York law, which was enacted, will turn off notifications during certain hours. It removes targeted feeds from being able to be accessed during certain hours, or I think for children. The targeted feeds is at all times for children, and just in general bans the commercialization of children's data and so on. One of my favorite reactions to this piece, "Ending Big Tech's Child Exploitation" by Zephyr, was someone on Twitter, I believe, or maybe it was one of my friends. No, it was on Twitter. Someone said, "Hey, can we get that for adults? Because I'm also addicted as an adult to the same phenomena." And so I think, we're getting there. There's something bubbly. And this Vivek Murphy proposal is just part of a broader social understanding about the need for reform that's forming on the left and the right. So, for example, as Zephyr points out in her piece, similar reform proposals are underway in very, very red states. So you might think, well, it's New York, it's a state that's a fan of regulation. You're not going to get this in Republican states, but no, that's not true. Kentucky is considering similar legislation. So I think overall it's good, even if like the idea of like a warning label on big tech itself won't be effective. It's indicative of a mood of reform. And it's a kind of, not talking about the form of reform, it's the kind of reform that I think Compact is all about promoting, which is that reform happens in the center. Left and right have to come together, notwithstanding their differences, and say, how can we craft something that solves our very real crises? So kudos to our Surgeon General.
I don't have too much to add to that. I think one thing that I'd remark here is probably a useful shift is a lot of the discourse about the supposed dangers of social media during the Trump years in particular was focused on, this sort of misinformation idea. And my repeated mantra or, sort of slogan throughout that period was to say, what really matters is not what it makes you think, if anything, or what, the content of ideas that it, exposes you to, but how it makes you feel. So I think what matters more is the affective dimension of it and how it shifts your affective relationship to the world. And so I think a lot of the focus on, the supposedly dangerous content that was circulating and the need to censor or restrict it, regardless of what we think of the sort of free speech, et cetera, implications of that, was simply misguided insofar as what has actually shifted has to do with our affective posture towards the world and not the particular contents that are circulating. And so I do think that, this also relates to its sort of bipartisan character, right? That I think people who don't agree on what specific stuff should be censored, just by being parents or, being aware of the kind of, seeming shifts in childhood and adolescence that have been brought about by this can at least agree that this is a significant phenomenon in terms of how it seems to affect the mood and I mean, just one, totally anecdotal, but I think widely observed thing that I certainly can report is that from teaching, particularly in the years after the pandemic, or sort of during and after the pandemic, where you saw a generation whose social life was abruptly shifted almost entirely onto technology, it did really affect their ability to just like sit in a room and have a conversation with people in a negative way. And that was very notable to me. But it wasn't, it was an intensification or a kind of further extreme development of tendencies I'd already seen underway well before that. And so I think we can probably have a more productive conversation about technology to the extent that we get away from this kind of idea that, there are these dangerous ideas out there that need to be censored or, that we need to protect people from, and focus more on the, how it makes us feel, how it makes people feel, how it changes the entire experience of childhood, and the ability of people to become, kind of socialized in a way that, and this relates to the Santos and Zingales piece, like in a way that is conducive to democratic collective existence. I think those are the really crucial questions, and fortunately, they seem to be ones that that people are able to come together on, regardless of their partisan positioning. So I think overall, it's regardless of like how much this particular proposal affects us. Overall, I think it's good. Just one remark on cigarette warning labels. Saurabh, did the labels in the UK are much more terrifying, right? They're like, the cigarette packs are all, they're not allowed to have any kind of logo, right? It's just like the same font for all of them, and then it's like these horrifying photographs of atrophied lungs and stuff like that. And I was wondering if that had any more effect than the more milquetoast ones that we have in the US.
Yeah. So when I lived in Britain from 2014 to 2018, the really hideous cigarette packets had not yet been unveiled or promulgated as a requirement, as a matter of public health law. What you still had was you still had the logo of the whatever brand you smoked, but it was just a much bigger surgeon's, whatever the equivalent is, like warning label. It's like huge black Helvetica font, all caps. Cigarettes will make your organs shrivel, whatever. Just like very like you will die. But now like when I go to Europe, obviously much of Europe, especially Britain, they have this model which is Australian style, which is you get like hideous teeth, like sepsis growing on gums and etc. And just it just says like Marlboro Light or Dunhill or whatever the brand might be, without even the logo. And I have to say that if I live there, that might have an effect on me. I may actually not buy them. I know there are Brits who have these like custom boxes that you buy the cigarette and you put it inside this packet so that you don't see the hideous picture. It might affect me, and I'll tell you why. Because the reason I picked up smoking, or one reason I picked up, smoking, was because a friend of mine went abroad at that point, before any of these kinds of, this was when I was a teenager, and came back and brought all of us cartons of Dunhill cigarettes. And Dunhill International are the ones that come in a square box, and the square box is divided in half. And there's like you open every 10 so that the other 10 stays whatever dry or whatever the benefit is. And the Dunhill International pack is unbelievably, it's a marvel of design. The fact that, first of all, it doesn't look like other packs. It's not rectangular. It's this stately British lion logo of British American Tobacco, perfect square. And in the non-light version, it's this crimson color. It just looks marvelous. And I was like, I want that. I want whatever is associated with this chic square box. I want what's inside. And, I still smoke Dunhill International cigarettes, which are very expensive and sometimes hard to to find elsewhere if you're not living in a major metropolitan area. And, if I lived in a place where my Dunhills had a picture of disgusting lungs, it might help marginally. That might push me to quit, because the design is part of it, the allure, the whatever. For me, at least. I don't know. Maybe not for others.
I also, a really horrifying experience was I went into a duty free in Heathrow the last time I was there. And if you go in there, it's like the cigarette section is cordoned off. So it's like the sort of, porno section in old video stores, where there's like this sort of shameful place in the back you have to go into, and you go in there and it's these rows and rows of these blank boxes with like these horrifying pictures of different, like, just disgusting, horrifying health outcomes. And it was like a chamber of horrors, basically. And it was one of the most shocking things I've seen for a while, where you go in there and like there's row after row of just like these different horrible pictures. And I was like, yeah, that is, I don't know. I feel like that's pretty effective.
It is. It's so like, I think in terms of cigarette package design, I'm not going to let this go. I love this topic. Sorry. European cigarettes are some of the best. So for me, Dunhill International, which is a British brand, and then the other one where the design is just unspeakably alluring to me is the French brand Gauloise, of course, famously associated with Sartre and all these kind of French intellectuals on the left bank. And the only place where you can get them without those hideous pictures and get the actual logo of the kind of asterisk Gaulish hat, whatever it is that is the Gauloise logo, is in the United States at duty free. But if you can find them at Heathrow, but it's in that chamber of horrors, and you can't find the logo. I'll stop. But like, cigarette design is really important. It's a mark of
so if Vivek Murthy is listening, if he really wants to get serious, he should do a study of how they package cigarettes in Europe, and put that on. Like when you log onto Twitter or Facebook, the first thing you see is like some horrifying video of a suicide or something, right? That's how you get really serious.
I thought you were saying he should implement the
box
thing. I was like, I don't have that many pleasures in my life, Jeff, and I've lived like 40 years. I'm okay.
I was trying to think of what the social media warning label equivalent would be. Just so as soon as you go to the site, it shows you some horrible video, like, I don't know. They're like, they could get like the people who did Black Mirror to make the video, that could work. That could work.
Okay, I think we'll probably start a spin-off podcast to sort of geopolitics through cigarette brands. This could be a winner. Um, okay, finally, an article, one of those articles that seems to unite left and right in a sort of mutually shared cringe and hatred, um, which is always impressive. But one might imagine that these articles are perhaps written for this purpose, to irritate everyone. In any case, this was a widely circulated article published in The Atlantic about rich people and quiet, and it's this kind of sort of quasi working class defense of loudness in cities and how it's all very wonderful and communal, and how the author was told off repeatedly in her fancy Ivy League university for being loud, even though she was talking in the library, for example, which is, in the quiet room in the library, which, really the clue's in the name there. And I must say, living just to start this off, I where I live in London, Southeast London, is quite poor. It's quite noisy as well, and it's really very unpleasant most of the time. I mean, I live in a council block that has sometimes people playing music at 3 a.m., drug dealers, people with mental health issues screaming and swearing on the streets. Just this morning I was outside and the usual guy was ranting and swearing and drinking beer at 9 in the morning. And this is a reality of living in a major city. And actually this noise is not really communal. It's really the sound of I don't know, like crisis or breakdown often, or a kind of fraying of the social contract, and often people are in really quite bad situations. And I think there's something kind of definitely cringy, definitely kind of awkward and irritating about this article, because one of the implications seems to be that kind of poor people don't need or don't deserve quiet, right? And I think this is one of the responses, right? Like the idea that somehow poor people are naturally louder, or that this is somehow tied to race, and the author plays up kind of Puerto Rican background in some sense. And then the idea that the some people and some classes are naturally more vivacious and more lively, and so on. And it's perhaps an awkward argument made in a slightly embarrassing way. But what did you guys make of it?
I had the same take, and lots of people did. It was one of those articles that got owned on Twitter, and rightly so. On X, I'm sorry. Bhaskar Sankara of The Nation and Jacobin had a great response, typical of his consistent sort of sanity and pragmatism and realism. He says, "The Atlantic nailed it. Poor people love living near expressways and having nighttime noise complaints go unaddressed." And another person wrote, it's a longer tweet, so I can't kind of quote it that easily, but the point is that it's only people who didn't live in actual poverty that romanticize what they imagine to be the sort of vibrant life of a poor community, which with all its noise, and they imagine what they imagine noise is like in such communities is like an abuela, a Hispanic grandmother, like cooking, whatever tacos while she's listening to like Latin music, and on another corner it's like Chinese men playing mahjong and so on. But in reality, it's what you described, Nina, which is like the addict yelling, the late night music very loud that doesn't let children sleep, and people who have to work in the next morning are troubled by it, and drug deals and violence. That's the kind of noise that you're living in.
So I think, like many, this is framed as being about gentrification. It's interesting that was such a huge subject of sort of media coverage for so long, and it seems to have subsided in part because the general trend in cities has been towards this kind of reversal of where things kind of got shitty again. And although there is still a kind of whatever, rents and housing prices are going up. But I mean, this is like what I've remarked before is that, the post-COVID era in major cities is like this weird horrifying combination of like the 70s and the 90s, where like everything is constantly getting more expensive, but also shittier, and like the sort of, we're experiencing like urban decay of the sort that we saw in the 70s, but like in the 90s, everything is still like getting more expensive, and it's a very weird, reality. But it is interesting that this article felt like kind of a throwback. Like I would have imagined it being published 10 years ago, and kind of in sort of peak like early woke digital media, when you had all these outlets like Mike, and you had like BuzzFeed and all these and the sort of woke versions of like Gawker and Vice. Like they would have published something like this. And so it's interesting to see like the Atlantic kind of publishing this kind of woke clickbait stuff, seemingly sort of 10 years after it was at its peak. So that's kind of another interesting thing about it. As far as the article itself, look, I mean, I think like many arguments about gentrification, it conflates and confuses a whole bunch of different phenomena. But, like having lived in Latin America, it's simply like true that there are cultures that have higher levels of tolerance for sound and noise, and like that actually feel more comfortable. Like just a random story, like, or a random kind of anecdotal thing. Like I've been in numerous places in Latin America where like if you go into like a restaurant or bar and you're like the first person there, or like you get there relatively early, and there aren't that many people there, sometimes the management will just like turn on music like high blast, because that's the kind of general sense of like how you create a vibe of. And I've just noticed that like you go into a place that's relatively empty, but so you just kind of want to chat because like it hasn't really and instead like no, they want to create this vibe. So I mean, I think there is a cultural dimension of this that is real. Another example I've noticed, Nina can maybe confirm this, but like I remember it kind of being a thing that on public transit in the UK, like in the London Underground, like people don't really talk. It's kind of like it's a seeming rule that like you don't really talk, and people are supposed to kind of keep their noise levels low, and that's sort of considered I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating this, but I remember going there after living in after living in South America, and like if you go on the metro in Santiago, Chile, or Buenos Aires, like people, chat. I mean, it's not necessarily noisy, but it's just like a regular level of conversation. And I just remember being on the tube in London, like after that, and being struck by like how quiet it was. So I think there are these kind of cultural norms that do differ. But this and then if you have a city like New York where you have these layers of people who have come from different places and bring certain levels of cultural norms with them, that does sometimes like create friction. So I don't think this is like entirely ridiculous. That said, I think it's it sort of turns it into this kind of moral. I mean, and that's really the function of these types of pieces, is to create this kind of moral drama in which you're supposed to, the presumed reader is like an upper middle class white person, probably white woman, who is supposed to kind of feel guilty for having ever objected to or had expectations about like noise levels that differed from other people who might have wanted to be noisier. And so you're supposed to kind of go through this moral self-examination in which you realize that the point at which you were unhappy because your neighbors were like blasting music late at night was actually you being an oppressor, right? And so then you're supposed to kind of and so the place this goes, and we see many examples of it, is like, I mean, it contributes to this kind of enshittification of cities where people are like, oh well, if I if I complain about this thing that is obviously horrible, then I'm somehow like oppressing somebody. And so, I mean, I remember another example of this, which is like the Mr. Softy ice cream trucks. And again, I think this was maybe like 5 to 10 years ago that I remember reading something about this, but like so the New York City did impose a rule that, and I mean, I've lived in various places in New York where like I have been tortured and tormented by Mr. Softy ice cream trucks with their horrible, annoying jingles, just like parked because I lived near a park. So they would just park there and like play the jingle over and over and over again for hours. And, you know, it is like truly just horrible and torture. And so the city finally did impose a rule that like when they can play the jingle while they're roving around, but like when they stop, they can't just play it on repeat. And I don't remember exactly when this was, but it was like pre-COVID. But I remember reading a similar discourse about it where I think there may have even been like an article that was covering the controversy over it, where there were these people who were like, basically, and again, I don't think these were just like, you know, these were basically some kind of community sort of NGO attached community activists. They weren't just like random residents, but there were people sort of saying like, well, you know, people demanding that the Mr. Softy truck turn off its music are like trying to gentrify, you know, our neighborhoods. And, you know, this is like a campaign of gentrification. I was like, this is just so bizarre. The idea that somebody, you know, that like an ice cream truck, you know, with this really annoying jingle playing over and over again is some kind of expression of like authentic, you know, barrio or whatever, like hood culture that like, you know, these horrible gentrifiers are trying to shut down this like authentic expression of culture, which is an ice cream which is like this ice cream truck. It was just so bizarre. But I mean, so that there is this idea, and it does, you know, it seems to animate these kind of, you know, so-called community activists who will like fight reforms such as, you know, making ice cream trucks shut up when they're sitting in the same place for hours on the grounds that this is somehow like stifling the authentic sounds of the city. I mean, this is an ice cream truck. This is not some kind of like ancient folk tradition. Like this is you know, it's a commercial operation. So I mean, this is really it's truly bizarre stuff. And it, you know, but part of what strikes me here is like seeing this argument made now because it feels very much of the like mid 2010s.
Yeah.
So
I will just say very quickly, sorry, that the New York City Mr. Softy ice cream is basically the best ice cream in the world. I will put it up against your fancy Roman gelatos, all that crap. Like just the basic vanilla, whatever additive they put in it to make it like ridiculously sweet, and it's the best. It's the best. By the way, it's like $8 per cone. So even as in economic terms, it is not necessarily a treat for the poor. Like, come on. At least, especially when, I mean, I bet the pricing is based on where they hawk their wares. Like when they do it like right by Central Park, it's easily $10 a cone or whatever. Whereas, of course, I mean, elsewhere they can do dynamic pricing. But yeah, it's just really. I haven't had breakfast, so I'm really.
Okay, I mean, maybe we should have another spin-off podcast of Compact's theories of ice creams. But I mean, we have this weird myth in the UK that Margaret Thatcher invented Mr. Whippy ice cream when she was a chemist. Anyway, who knows if that's true? But this is my contribution to ice cream discourse. But just very briefly on Jeff's point about British public transport and the silence. Well, yes, kind of, except that in the last few years we've seen a massive upsurge in so-called sodcasting, which is a funny neologism to describe people blasting music from their phone or playing music videos or playing videos or watching their phone without headphones, and people are engaging in this increasingly, and it's incredibly annoying, especially because a lot of the time people are listening to something for 4 seconds before they get distracted and bored and then change it. So it's not even like a one track. It's like it's just this deranging, like insistent switching between noise. So this is actually happening a lot more, and it people are very annoyed about it, and it's quite difficult to intervene. You never know whether to say anything. I was on a plane recently and someone was sodcasting on a plane, and I was like, this is a really bad development. What is going on here? Anyway, so yeah, it's both silent and incredibly noisy.
And it's not limited to like the urban poor. It's like old people on airplanes. It's like, ma'am, have you heard of headphones? Why do they do this? It's just become a thing. It's sodcasting. I hadn't heard. That's a brilliant coinage for that activity, and it enrages me. I don't care what the Atlantic thinks. I think people who do that should go to prison, not jail.
I agree.
Prison.
I agree. Okay, and with that sort of freewheeling episode on cigarettes and ice cream and sodcasting, I'd like to thank Saurabh, Jeff, and Stephen Adubatu, our producer. Don't forget to subscribe at compactmag.com if you haven't already, and thank you for listening.
The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. I just wanted to get that in there.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.